On today's World Insight with Tian Wei, American companies who bear the brunt of the China-US war over tariffs. How are they coping? And the pursuit of beauty in film costumes and scene design. That's with Oscar winner Tim Yip of Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon fame.
Always appropriate.
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live on CGTN. After several rounds of trade consultation, it seems that the world's two largest economies are back at square one, some say. Making matters worse, the trade friction is now taking a toll on the world economy. Americans, too, are feeling the heat from the shimmering battle of tariffs.
America's false narrative on China. An article from Stephen Roach, a senior fellow and lecturer at Yale University, after Washington announced a tariff hike to 25% on Chinese goods worth $200 billion. In the article, he said Washington has been loose with facts, analysis, and conclusions, and the American public has been far too gullible in its acceptance of this false narrative. Sadly, fixating on scapegoats is apparently much easier than taking a long, hard look in the mirror. After the 11th round of discussions between the U.S. and China in Washington on May 9 and 10, Chinese Vice Premier Liu Ha said both sides are willing to move forward with the talks. However, Washington announced new plans, shaking confidence in the progress of consultations. Experts say tariffs on both Chinese and U.S. goods will harm the interests of U.S. companies and consumers and will ultimately hurt the U.S. economy.
Despite what President Trump says, claiming that the Chinese pay tariffs on Chinese imports to the United States, it's actually the U.S. consumers and businesses that pay. Tariffs are a tax. They're a tax on imports. And so the receiver of those goods are the ones that pay that tax. And again, that's the U.S. consumers and businesses.
We have to be able to make a profit and at least break even. And where we're at today, for the next 4 to 5 years, I don't see that happening until we have this trade war settled.
As a nonprofit, we never thought tariffs would affect us, but they do. President Trump says that China is paying these tariffs, but I see the cost on my invoices. A 10% increase in the tariff means that 10% more babies are at risk. President Trump, stop the trade war now.
The Chinese Commerce Ministry said the impact of the trade spat with the U.S. on China's economy is manageable. Beijing will keep an eye on the nation's economic indicators and take necessary measures to stabilize the economy. The Chinese government vowed to protect the legitimate rights of foreign companies in China and maintain a stable, fair, transparent, and predictable business environment for them.
So, what's the impact of ramped-up trade tensions between China and the U.S. on companies' strategies? Let's turn to our panelists for the first round of discussion. In our Beijing studio, Tim Stratford, the chairman of AmCham here in China. Welcome, sir. Also joining us here, Jacob Parker, Vice President of China Operations from the USChina Business Council. Welcome as well. Let me go to you first, because you just traveled to Washington on an annual door knock campaign. What have you found out when you were talking, and what was the atmosphere in Washington?
Well, we were there before the trade talks really fell apart, and so there was great optimism that we were about to have a deal, and so it was really at the end of the week when we were all surprised to see the sudden negative turn of events. I think we talked to 20 members of the Senate. We talked to people, different branches of the executive branch, talked to people in think tanks, and by and large, people were encouraged with the progress in the trade talks, and we were already looking ahead to how are we going to implement them, implement any agreement in a smooth way. And so I think we've been very disappointed to see the breakdown. It's not unusual for there to be hiccups at the end of a negotiation like this. You know, each side sort of has to test the other to make sure they're getting the best deal. The U.S. does that, China does that. But what's particularly troubling right now is that a lot of the testing seems to be going on in a very public way, And that kind of corners each side from a political point of view and makes it harder to compromise. So that's what we're most disappointed to.
And of course, Jacob, you've been staying in China, working closely with your members. What exactly is the ambience right now, in a way, when you talk to them and their top concerns and challenges as they see it?
So I think our members have been extremely concerned and surprised about when the president's tweet was announced. The increase of tariffs of the original batch and then the additional $300 billion in tariffs that were announced for public comment were both very concerning. Some of the anecdotes we've heard from companies, one, it has shown their customers in the China market that perhaps their supply and cost is not reliable. So we've heard many of those customers are beginning to look at European and Japanese and domestic suppliers in some cases to ensure a consistency of supply, both from a price perspective and then also just from an import perspective. We've also heard from some companies that just generally the uncertainty around the tariffs and the potential for them to increase in the future has made them pause on their investment decisions in the China market and reevaluate the risk of their supply chains in the China market.
I see.
So now for new investments, they're looking Southeast Asia, Mexico, other places as a result of these tariffs.
Well, of course, none of those markets is as big as what we are talking about here in China still. Another layer of complication, of course, is about Huawei. With the executive order came on earlier, and then the Commerce Department announcement. But I'm not going to the government side because none of you is representing the U.S. government. But certainly, many of the companies that Huawei is getting its supplies of components and parts from are members of your company. Qualcomm, Broadcom, Google, Microsoft, just to name a few. 11 billion, according to the latest reports in some media reports about Huawei spending on the suppliers from the U.S. side. So to you, Tim, what would that mean for companies, not only your members, but also companies as a whole, thinking about the potential?
Well, of course, it greatly complicates the business plans that these companies had. One of the things that concerns us is the broader impact. Not only is there an economic impact, but you know, we see many of our Chinese partners in China who don't understand what the U.S. is doing, and it's very difficult for them to not come to the conclusion that the real goal of the United States is not just trying to have a more level playing field in terms of economic policy, but actually to try to contain and curtail China's economic and technological development. And so far, there hasn't been enough information presented by the U.S. government that has been persuasive to let people think that there was some, you know, strong, legitimate national security purpose behind this. We just don't have that information, and so a lot of people are coming to a very negative conclusion about the U.S.'s intentions.
It's not only the business community not know. If I remember right, there are those on the Capitol Hill who have been also complaining about what about the recent policy-making process in Washington and whether they should be informed about what exactly is going on. To you, Jacob, the same question rather. If one government is doing things like this to another company from another country, then there could be enough reasons for the others to act in similar logic, which is to disturb the global supply chain. So I guess that's probably an even bigger danger than just one company itself, in a way, because your members are all operating globally.
That's right.
They're multinational companies.
That's right. I think that we've seen two impacts just over the last 2 days, and it's still too early to say what the full implications are going to be. The first is obviously companies will begin to lose business with Huawei, not just in the China market, but wherever they operate around the world, because Huawei being added to the entity list, if that's fully executed on this week as we expect it to be, or next week as we expect it to be, then they will no longer be able to sell to them. That'll be a big cut in their business overnight. I think the other concern is the potential retaliatory actions that China might take, and those may be obvious or less obvious. I'll give you an example that one of our companies told us today. They were in a long-term negotiation with a state-owned enterprise who had a public tender for the acquisition of a certain semiconductor product. And unfortunately, at the very end, when they thought they would win that tender, just over the last few days, it's ended up falling through. And they've been unable to contact anyone at the company. And they've heard private discussions with some of the people involved that they're no longer considered to be a stable supplier because of the risk of this kind of entity issue coming up in the future.
Of course, it's a lot of headaches for people like you who are trying to represent the interests of American companies operating globally, particularly here in China. Before I bring in another speaker, can I ask both of you another legitimate question, which is, despite of the lobbying efforts, the explanations, the discussions, communications that both of your organizations have been put into in terms of your communication with Washington, particularly the current administration, really, do you still matter to the policies going on right now in Washington? Or you've been listened but not heard at all?
I think the key to our being heard is to understand what are the problems that the U.S. administration thinks they're trying to address, and make sure that the solutions that we propose will also make sense to them in terms of the things that they're worried about. One of the big problems we have policy differences between the U.S. and China on economic matters, and then we also have national security concerns that each country has about the other. So that's quite natural, but those are two very different policy areas, and they have different rationales, they have different government agencies that are in charge of them, and if you don't separate those two policy areas out and explain exactly what you're doing, it's very easy for everything to be a jumbled mess and everything's unpredictable. So, for example, Huawei is a national security situation. At least that's the rationale that's being given. And under those cases, it may be appropriate to go after a particular company. But you have to define national security very narrowly, and you should only do that if you have a very strong reason to do so. And the U.S. government recently has defined national security in very broad ways that can interfere with
executive order talking about foreign adversaries, even though it's not being interpreted clearly, and therefore anybody can use the policy to portray their own interests if they want to, in a way. Jacob, to you.
I would say it's really important to understand how we got to this position, and organizations like ours are completely aligned with the Trump administration's goals of trying to correct some of the challenges that our companies experience in the China market. It's true that we disagree with some of the tactics that are being employed, but I think from some of our members' perspectives, those tactics are beginning to get some results.
All right, we'll see how things would play out. That's why we need to have another layer of our discussion. Later there will be a Chinese guest also joining us. But for now, it is not just the business community, but also the academic community that are having some different views compared to what's going on right now with the policies coming from Washington. Yale University's Stephen Roach, for example, he has been a long-time China hand, as some say. He sounded the alarm over the wholly blaming China for America's economic challenges, many of them self-inflicted, according to him. Take a look. He set the record straight that trade deficits are a direct result of shrinking domestic savings in the U.S. owing to big U.S. budget deficits. He also noted supply chain distortions that makes the China-U.S. trade imbalance seem bigger. And he said it seemed much easier to paint China as the villain in making America great again. And more on this, we are joined by a Chinese panelist as well. He's coming from the academic circle in Hong Kong, Mr. Xiao Geng, professor at Peking University, HSBC Business School based in Hong Kong. Professor Xiao, you've been attentively listening over the past few minutes to your two colleagues here in Beijing studio. From your academic perspective, is there much chance that the two countries will be able to have a deal if acted reasonably from both sides?
Well, I think the deal still is possible since actually trade war is going to hurt both sides. And I think U.S. of course will lose trade war just like China, you know, and that doesn't make any sense to either politicians or the American people. So sooner or later, the two sides will find a way to deal with the trade, which is actually easier. But I think the question is the so-called national security shadow price. I mean, national security is a concern for both countries, but the question is how much you want to pay. And I think through the trade wars which happened, I mean, actions in last few days, few weeks, each side are testing the cost and how much each side can actually bear
absorb,
the cost.
rather digest
so
in a way. So to you, Professor Xiao, since the other two guests have already spoken about this, how much chance is there in the short term that the two sides, particularly the negotiation teams, will be able to come together, which of course is the next step, before the next step happens, I mean?
Well, I think the key is for both leaders, leaders to realize that there's no way China and the United States can separate each other in trade. Every day there are 2 billion trade going on. And any disruptions is going to cut the supply chain, around the world. And that's a problem which is going to lead to even bigger problem in terms of both countries' people and companies.
Yeah,
so there will be reactions from people and the companies.
But probably that's your thought. Maybe some of the policymakers do not necessarily agree with you. Jacob, many say the Huawei issue, you don't have to comment on the specific company, it's just the issue itself, that is a attempt to decouple the two economies, because you see a lot of companies working with one another in this overall ecosystem that it's related to Huawei, and not to mention some of the other tech cooperations, because that is one of the most important cooperation between China and the United States, even money-wise. So, Jacob, your thought here?
I think it's important to make a distinction between the business community, which under no circumstances supports this idea of decoupling, and perhaps some very narrow attitudes that are existing in the administration. And those attitudes certainly have a perspective on China today that perhaps it's a strategic threat, perhaps we need to do more to protect the United States, and that's part of the rationale, I think, behind what led us to the position today. But I can tell you that the business community sees globally integrated supply chains as a critical part of their global competitiveness and ensuring that American consumers and Chinese consumers continue to receive the best price for their products, and they will continue to advocate for that going forward.
And of course, what's going on in the administration is forever a puzzle for all of us watching from outside, because there were reports talking about certain factions working together against others. There's personal interactions and chemistry going on. Tim, I don't want you to give us the definite answer because I don't think you know it either. But the fact that there are uncertainties from that perspective, politically speaking, what would that mean for a later stage, if there were any discussion from both sides about a deal?
I think that in both governments, I think the U.S. government is more visible about how things work just because of different systems, but I think in both governments there's a lively debate about how closely can the two countries cooperate and how much do they trust each other. If you talk about national security, both countries have legitimate national security concerns, and so but based on my experience, governments are very good at finding problems, but they're not always the best at figuring out the best solution. And I think there needs to be a close collaboration with the technical experts that you have in companies to figure out how to address the legitimate interests of the governments, but to maximize the amount of business that our two countries can do together.
But at this point, with the uncertainties that all of us agree exist right now, what about the economies to, the economic potential of the two economies, China and the U.S.? To you, Professor Xiao, I probably would ask about China's, because you're a China scholar. Now we heard the National Commission of Reform have been talking about the necessary steps could be taken to further enhance the growth of the economy. We also heard from the Commerce Department here in China about the potential of China's economic growth. So what do you make of the current uncertainties and the capability of China to maintain its growth and also to maintain its trade status with other economies under the current circumstances? Professor Xiao.
Well, I think for the last few years, China has been pushing all kind of reforms. And I think in terms of further opening and also reduction of some of the costs, this will continue. And because of the international situations, the outside pressures, so a lot of reforms will come out much faster and much forceful. So in terms of the Chinese economy, I think the key drivers is actually domestic demand. So that means that the trade is actually not so important now, given the massive purchasing powers Chinese households already have.
But it is
and also there are a lot of
important.
infrastructure.
The confidence in the economy is very important.
Yeah, the confidence is important, but the confidence actually depends on, in a way, how the government will handle this issue. And the government is now very clear. It wants to support the private sector and want to keep opening, and also a lot of policies will be more stable and long-lasting. So this will gradually, I think, help to restore the confidence.
I see.
Because the Chinese economy today is then driven by domestic demand and domestic investment.
That's true. What about the U.S. economy? Some say, even though you are not an economist yourself, but from the business perspective, Tim, the administration have given a lot of incentives to boost the economy, probably using all the tools in the box already. So what about next year, which is even more crucial for political purposes? Will the U.S. economy be able to, under the current uncertainties, still thrive? What does that mean, the uncertainty involving the economy, economic growth, for the current negotiations, to say the least? Tim?
Well, certainly the current negotiations are a damper on a lot of economic activity. In AmCham, 65% of our members have said that they're reevaluating their China strategy. Almost a third said that they're delaying or postponing investment decisions. And so there's economic activity that would be positive for the U.S. and for China that is being delayed because of these uncertainties. The two governments have made a remarkable effort over the last year to negotiate. These are the most intensive negotiations that we've seen in a whole generation since China joined the WTO. And the business community wants the governments to finish the job. There are real problems that have to be addressed, but the governments can reach an agreement, and that's what we want them to do. They need to get through the current rough period, they need to get back to the negotiating table, and they need to capitalize on all the hard work both sides have been doing.
If they can, or they see there's a chance for both of them. Jacob, to you as well about that question, and also the fact that the world is not just about China and the U.S. There are other players, important one as well, Europeans, for example. And within the European continent, there's France, Germany, big economies. You also see that in Japan, an Asian economy, Australia. So what about apparently an evolving world that it is not a clear cut anymore? You are my allies and therefore I will always be listening to you. But rather, it seems that economies are having a very clear mind these days, trying to make their own decision. What does that mean overall to you as a business?
I think that most other countries should have a vote in this process. This can't just be a U.S.-China issue. This is a global issue that affects all countries that are involved, and we need more involvement from those countries going forward.
Well, we're running out of time, gentlemen. I know this is a very important discussion. I'm sure when things evolve, we're going to have all of you come back to our studio once again to share your insights and your wisdom. Thank you so much for your sincerity and also your thoughts. Jacob Parker, Tim Stratford, and Xiao Gang. Really appreciate it, gentlemen. Thank you.